So that reading was from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 55, verse 1 through 11. What is the first thing that you notice about this passage and the reading that Kate did for us? Anything jump out to you right away? What kind of, go ahead, Russell.
I was just saying that Isaiah moves in and out of speaking like he is God.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that. All right, so there's multiple voices happening here. What's the style? What kind of reading is this, Joanne?
It's more of a dialogue.
It's a dialogue, okay? It's poetry,
Yeah.
right? And what would you think that poetry does to our listening and hearing of the text?
Gives us a cadence to follow.
It gives us a cadence to follow, yep. So there's a rhythm to it.
Generally, poetry is very visual.
Poetry's really visual, yep. Really rich in metaphor, right? Repetitive. It changes the way that we are supposed to read and hear and interpret the text. It also probably, if it's used liturgically, helps us to memorize. The way that songs help us memorize things, poetry helps us memorize things. A lot of Isaiah and a lot of the prophets is poetry, and a lot of poetry today, I think, is often prophetic. When I think of the prophets of our world, the first grouping of people that I think of are the visual artists, the musicians, the poets, and the comedians in our midst. Those are our truth tellers because they can tell the truth in a way that's not direct enough that it stings. Now it can still sting, but sometimes when you come at someone directly, especially with a hard truth, it's more challenging for that person to hear it. And so poetry gives us a different way into truth. These words from David White, who is one of my favorite poets. I don't actually like to read his poetry. I like to listen to him recite his poetry because his voice is so lovely. But he says, "The poet lives and writes at the frontier between deep internal experience and the revelations of the outer world. There is no going back once this frontier has been reached. A new territory is visible, and what has been said cannot be unsaid. Poetry is a break for freedom. In a sense, all poems are good. All poems are an emblem of courage and the attempt to say the unsayable, but only a few are able to speak to something universal, yet personal and distinct at the same time, to create a door through which others can walk into what previously seemed unobtainable realms in the passage of a few short lines." Does that resonate with anybody? That poetry has that sort of power to them? So that's the kind of text that we're working with tonight, right? It's different than some of the other readings that we've had, which, the creation story is a poem, but it's also a grand myth, a grand fable, a grand story, right? The flood narratives, the passage through the Red Sea are these big stories that are an attempt to contain or create a container for how we determine how we make meaning out of our lives, how we make meaning out of circumstances and the world. Poetry is doing the same thing, but it's coming at it in a very, very different way. So, What else do you notice? What struck you? Did anything shimmer? I was listening to Krista Tippett this week, and she had a guest on. It was actually her book, Becoming Wise. And I had heard this person on her podcast too a number of years ago, and they talk about words that shimmer and how kids pick up on those. And those are breadcrumbs for us to follow, particularly with kids. But did anything shimmer for you or stand out? Jackie?
I'm not sure it shimmered,
Mm-hmm.
but I was so aware of contradictory statements.
Mm.
So, you want this, but you don't have to pay for it, and it doesn't cost money. And later on, he says, I will give you my words, but when they return, they'll be changed. There just was a lot of contradiction.
Yeah.
Or opposition.
How often are things that are true, they feel very contradictory, right? The deeper truths of life. Sometimes we call those paradox, sometimes oxymorons, just one of my favorite words in the lexicon. So yeah, poetry and the prophets in particular, the Hebrew prophets, they hold complexity really, really well. They create a tension for us that invites us and sometimes forces us to try to figure out what is really true and what means the most.
And it really stops you. I wanted a copy in front of me because I wanted to go, what was that?
Yeah, it's arresting.
There's
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. Anyone else? All right. I want to get to something that Russell mentioned, and that is there are different voices in this passage that are speaking, and sometimes the switch in voice is not easily recognizable to us. And the passage actually begins out of context for us. There's a reason why for the Easter Vigil we put this reading where we do, because the readings are intending to progressively get us further and further into the story of salvation. And this passage kind of breaks salvation wide open for everyone, right? But chapter 54 of Isaiah is the first part of this poem, and it is God having a conversation with Zion. And Zion is a place, but it is personified in the form of a woman, sometimes called Lady Zion, sometimes referred to as Lady Wisdom. And only by reading Hebrew do we get that, right? So unless I read somebody else who has done the work in the Hebrew, which that's what I did, to find out that this is a strong feminist passage, and that Lady Zion is the physical and metaphysical site and source of salvation. And so a lot of this is a conversation between God as a male figure in the pronouns and Lady Zion. Then there's also the prophet, and there's also a commentator in this passage. And so that, to me, I think is helpful and interesting to point out. So in chapter 54, which we don't read, it uses a very particular feminine pronoun 34 times. And then it's carried over into the first few verses of this passage. So the you that gets referenced, Y-O-U, mostly in the first 3 or 4 verses, are a feminine form of that second person plural or singular, whatever. One of the things that's really challenging, I think I've mentioned this before with English, is that we don't gender our language the way that a lot of languages have done throughout history that help clue us in to certain things, particularly when we're reading poetry and things like that. And so that's a part of what's happening here. And then there's a switch after, I think, verse 3, where Lady Zion stops speaking, and in verse 4, either the prophet or God begins speaking, depends on which scholars you read. I was pulling primarily from a woman named Simone Paganini, who's an Austrian theologian and biblical scholar, and so I think that was really helpful. We have this metaphor for salvation, and it's an invitation to this marketplace that you referenced, Jackie, but it's more like a great feast. And so the great marketplace that's being invited, we're being invited into, the people are being invited into, is more paradise than business transaction, because everything is for free. And so if we follow that rabbit trail, then we come to a conclusion that Lady Zion is a refuge for the poor. And so salvation is primarily for the poor and the marginalized, but is open to all and is free for all. And that, I think, is ultimately God's deepest hope for humanity. This passage is a lot easier to preach on than to teach on, because there's a lot of good stuff in here, so I'll try not to do that. Anything else come up? Did you notice a natural element that came up again?
Wind.
Was there wind in there? I can't remember. Waters. Come to the waters. Right? So all the other three passages that we've studied so far, water is a central motif and theme. It is both chaotic and destructive, but it also starts to become salvific. And this is also, again, part of the reason why in our tradition, in our Christian sacramental tradition, we have this as part of our Easter Vigil reading, because theologically we start to make the move as Christians towards baptism. And the earliest Christians, they were known as the people of the way, they used the season of Lent very specifically and intentionally to prepare people for baptism. And so all of Lent is this deep catechism to prepare people for their submersion under the waters and then their acceptance into the community. Part of the reason for doing that was because they were under Roman occupation and they were not allowed to practice their Christianity. And so to put people through this test, this catechism, it would reveal over time, over the course of 6 weeks, whether or not somebody was a spy for Caesar or they were really wanted to be a part of the community. That's something we don't have to deal with in our reality, right? But there are still places around the world where that sort of thing remains true, where you have to be really, really careful who comes into your community, because you don't know if they're coming to try to destroy it from within for other purposes and other gains. And so this invitation to the waters is salvific for the Hebrew people and beginning to change that narrative, right? Because the Red Sea begins to change the narrative around the waters. prior to the crossing of the Red Sea, the waters were always something to be feared. They were always something that was chaotic. But in different increments, they become more a part of their freedom, and they become more hopeful. So I think that part begins to transition us in the Easter Vigil when we start to make our turn towards, well, physically in this space, we begin in here, right? And then we move into the narthex to do our baptismal remembrance, right? And so when you're going through the vigil this year, in a few weeks, couple weeks, maybe be thinking about that, right? That the readings, the first 5 readings that we do from the Hebrew Scriptures, they're moving us into the story in a different way. So there's a transition here. And then last week, I mentioned the word rhetoric, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, when I talked about some of the more important tools that I use when I read scripture, and I talked a little bit about rhetoric. Does anybody remember what rhetoric is? What is the goal of rhetoric? I think I'm hearing it. What'd you say?
Listening.
Listening. It forces us to listen in order to do what? Respond. Right? So it is persuasive speech. So did any of the verbs, particularly at the very beginning of the passage, did any of those stand out to anybody? Probably did at the time. Come, listen, and it says listen carefully. Incline your ear, right? And then a series of verses that begin with the word see what I'm doing, right? This is a persuasive invitation. How many of you were here when the bishop came and visited in January? And how many of you remember Dan Roeder telling a story about when he first got here? Anybody remember that part? What was the phrase he used about this place? Aggressive hospitality. Right? That's part of what is happening here, is that Lady Zion and Yahweh are sort of aggressively inviting the people into a way of life, and is calling the nation, calling the people to make a decision. Go to Zion. Go to this place where the bread is free. If you're thirsty, there's plenty to drink, and you don't have to pay for any of it. It's all provided for you. It's a place where we are all equal. We're all on equal footing. That is the hope for God's humanity. God's hope for humanity. To something that we talked about in our vestry retreat, was how do we as a community go beyond the berm, which I love that phrase, right? All around the perimeter we have this berm, and it's kind of a little bit of a wall between us and the community. How do we go beyond the berm and invite people into the feast that we're all enjoying here? That's part of our work. That's part of our invitation, because it's not just God inviting us, it's also God inviting others through us, others who aren't here yet. So the power of persuasion and persuasive speech. That's all I got. What else? What do you have? What other questions or things came up for you in this passage? Yeah, sure.
A little embarrassing moment. What passage are we on? I caught Isaiah
55.
Thank you.
Yeah, verses 1 through 11.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, Chris.
I